Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us and at Crossroads and for a little bit of patience and grace. We are obviously having technical issues, as you can see if you're in the room, trying to get the projectors to work and to play nice with computers, and that's always a fun piece. So as we get started, I will keep working on that piece of it, but we may have to go without in the room. Hopefully online you'll be able to see the slides that our presenter has brought. But thank you for being here at Crossroads. I'm Connie Ryan, the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and really glad that you have joined us to have this conversation today. Crossroads really is just about having civil dialogue on important issues that matter to all of us. And so we're going to talk about mental health. And I have with us today Leslie Carpenter, who is a phenomenal advocate at the State House. I can't express how much I respect her and her way of doing things. And she'll tell you her story. I'm not going to share that with you, but she's well respected at the State House as an unpaid, I believe, advocate, and there many days of the session. So Leslie Carpenter created Iowa Mental Health Advocacy and the organization, and spends a great deal of time at the State House advocating on behalf of Iowans who need services and our support. So with that, I will turn over to Leslie, and I'll keep working on the computer part of it, which I hope to get up because I know she has a lot of great slides. And if not, maybe we will share the PDF with folks after the fact. So Leslie Carpenter.
So we'll see. Can you hear on my microphone?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. I do hope for all of you in the room that the slides come up because the pictures are pretty much a lot of the story. But I label all of our advocacy talks ripples of hope. And if you could see the pictures, what you would see is where the St. Lawrence River joins into Lake Ontario. It's near where I grew up in northern New York State, in between New York and Canada. And in the early morning, on a big body of water like that, what you begin to see across the surface are ripples. And I think of each opportunity to come out and share part of our son's story and part of the history of why we have a mental health crisis in the first place, and some solutions as an opportunity potentially to gain more voices, more ripples, if you will, in the work of improving mental health care. And I always like to make it really clear that I am not a mental health professional. In fact, I was a physical therapist for 34 years, but retired about 3 or 4 years ago when I recognized that if I wanted to affect the changes that are needed, I really needed a whole lot more time than I had while I was working full time. So I still do teach at the University of Iowa's graduate PT program because I love that. But I do more teaching now for NAMI Iowa, NAMI National, actually. And I'm involved in a number of ways of advocacy, including serving on advisory councils, lobbying, as Connie mentioned. I am a volunteer lobbyist, and that's actually really freeing because I can speak a little bit more truth to a lot more power because I'm not beholden to keep anybody happy. And very specifically, I advocate for people who are much more seriously ill. So people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and bipolar disorders. Because many of them, the people that I am most advocating for, are way too sick to ever make it to the Capitol to advocate for themselves. So I'm very focused in on the most seriously ill. And what you'd be seeing now are pictures of my little boy. Our family, my husband and I, have 2 adult children, and I'm happy to tell you that our daughter is healthy and fine, recently married. She and her husband are building a house outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Our son, however, is not. He is extremely sick. He lives with a serious schizoaffective disorder, but when he was a baby and a child, through most of his childhood, he was very, very healthy. He was creative and artistic and athletic and funny, intelligent, and his little sister just adored him. And the picture on the far right, and I'm so sorry for those of you that can't see this, But it's the last picture that we have of him before he got sick. And it happened to be before a homecoming dance at West High. And the young woman in the picture with him is his girlfriend at the time, or was his girlfriend at the time. But then everything changed. And initially, we really thought we were dealing with teenage rebellion. But soon it became quite clear that that was not the case. And instead, it was that he was very sick. And he drew a self-portrait. And again, for those of you in the room, I'm so sorry that you can't see this, but what you can see is sadness within his expression. But in the background, there's also quite a bit of concerning imagery starting to show up in his artwork. But this picture is probably much more reflective of his experience at the onset of his brain illness. And for those of you in the room, what you see is a picture of him, but his head exploding. And that's a picture that we did not find at the time that he was getting sick. He hid it, just like most kids hide their illnesses for a very long time, as long as they possibly can. That's a human thing that happens. And we found it years later, hidden amongst his many, many sketch pads. And if anybody's interested in seeing his artwork on our website, Iowa Mental Health Advocacy, you can go there. And I will tell you that the artwork is very haunting, but it's what was going on in his head. And he had a pretty classic progression of the disease for somebody who develops a serious mental illness. In 2008, he called me from high school one afternoon. He was around 17 years old. And he said, "Mom, I'm not feeling very well. I really think I need to go home." And, you know, he was driving. So I said, "Sure, head on home." But after I hung up the phone, I recognized that there had been something different in his voice. And so I got my staff to rearrange my patients, and I left work and drove home to check on him. And I found him upstairs in his bedroom, but over on his desk was our family's largest carving knife. And I can remember looking at it and being confused. And so I asked him, "What are you doing with this knife here?" And initially he tried to tell me that he was going to make a sandwich. But, you know, that didn't make sense. And so I pushed him and I said, "No, seriously, what are you doing with this knife here?" And he said, "Well, I was thinking about killing myself today, Mom." And, you know, I don't think there's any parent that's ever ready to hear those words coming from their own child. It's unthinkable, right? And so we, like every other family that we have met since, sprang into action. We called his doctor, we got him in, he got admitted to the hospital the next day. And soon blood work revealed that he'd already been self-medicating with marijuana. And initially the docs told us that that was probably primary. And so we followed their lead and got him into rehab and with a psychiatrist and with a therapist. Not easily, but we did. And he actually ended up finishing up high school over in Rockford, Illinois, because we live in Iowa City. And I'm sorry, but it's way too easy for a young, smart, charismatic kid to get his hands on marijuana in a college town, right? So he graduated that program, eventually moved back home, started working, taking care of people in group homes. And he finally got enrolled at Kirkwood Community College, and we were really relieved. And he was doing great. He was taking a full slate of classes. It was going wonderfully. Until one late winter night when he called and he said, "Mom, I've just died. But please don't worry, because I've become God, and I need you to come get me and take me to go see Obama and Oprah, because I've got to save the world." And it was just like that fast, pressured speech, right? And so I climbed out of bed and I drove up to Cedar Rapids, picked him up, brought him home along with a kitten, and settled him in for the night and went to bed kind of hoping, kind of praying that he'd taken some other kind of drug that I didn't know about that would make him say these really odd things, right? Obviously, I was a little in denial still about what was really happening. Again, human nature. But in the morning, it was really clear that there was no drug that had worn off. He was completely delusional. And it was before we had 988, before we had mobile crisis, before we had an access center. So we ended up calling the sheriff's office and getting their help to get him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a manic psychosis of a bipolar type 1 disorder. And at that time, that's the stuff that made sense, right? And the medications helped, mostly. But 2 years later, his illness further progressed to where he began hearing these horrible voices. And they progressed his diagnosis to being a schizoaffective disorder, which a lot of well-meaning friends would say things to me like, "Well, Les, at least he doesn't have schizophrenia." Well, sadly, what they didn't realize, and neither did we initially, was that it's both schizophrenia with the voices and delusions, but also bipolar, which is not a happy or sad mood, right? No matter what you think. It is manic psychosis, which is where our son's brain most often likes to go be, and really scary depression. And it's really known as the most treatment-resistant illness. And I want you to hear what I just said. The illness is the most treatment-resistant illness, not the person. And that's an important distinction. And so for the past 16 years, our life has revolved around him going in and out of the revolving doors of 26 hospitalizations, 5 rehabs, 4 residential care facilities, 4 different group homes, our home, apartments in the community with community services. And he's been at the MHI in Independence twice. This last time, he's been able to be there for a year and a half. And I'm happy to tell you that that is finally the first time he's received what we consider to be competent, reasonable, appropriate mental health care for his illness, right? Not everybody needs to be there for that long. He has desperately needed that. And I'm here to tell you there's a lot more people that have also desperately needed that. So he is finally improving, and he's finally gaining the ability to understand that the medications help him, which is a key piece that we'll talk about a little later. And I share the picture of the brains, and for those of you in the room that can't see this, there's a normal healthy brain here and a brain that's very sick over on the other side. I share that picture of the brains very much because what I hope for people to take away today, if you hear nothing else from me, is that because we are unable to have somebody go to the hospital and stay there or some other setting with enough support to get the meds figured out, which can take years, right? And for them to stabilize enough to learn about their illness, and so can their loved ones, we are actually currently causing people's brains to become more sick, more damaged. When somebody's in a psychosis, it's like an acid eating away at the brain. And the longer we allow somebody to be in an untreated psychosis, and the more often they're in an untreated psychosis, the less functional they're going to end up being in the long run. And we have to change that trajectory. And if I were to say, what is my goal of all of my advocacy? That's my goal. We have to change that. And I share these pictures of what it was like for me before getting to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We took the family-to-family class. And what you see here on this one picture is a picture of the very famous statue called Melancholy of a Grieving Parent. And it really is something I've closely identified with because I felt like an empty shell of myself, right? My husband and I are fairly accomplished people. We had never met a problem prior to this that we couldn't research, we couldn't try harder, we couldn't figure out a way to solve it, right? But no matter what we did and what we advocated for, we could not get our son the care that he needed. And that is, I think, the most devastating thing that can happen to a person is to not be able to help your own child. And about the most we could do was advocate for him and bake him snickerdoodles. Some of you may have enjoyed a snickerdoodle today. If you haven't, please have one. And you might think, oh, isn't that sweet? She baked him his favorite cookie. Well, actually, since he's gotten sick, he's hardly eaten any of these himself. What they're about is as he was in a psychosis, he would be very megalomaniacal, very self-centered. I'm God, I'm a higher being, right? But as he would come back out of a psychosis into his more baseline personality, he'd be much more altruistic, right? And he would look around him in these psychiatric units and facilities and see all his fellow patients suffering. And so he would beg me to bring batches and batches and batches of cookies to give to his fellow patients, to give them something to enjoy, even if just for a moment. Since taking the family-to-family class and learning a lot and healing a lot, what I've become gradually is an advocate and probably much more so an activist. And initially, I really kind of resisted that label because, you know, it's not well accepted in our society today to be an activist. But when I read the definition that says that somebody has witnessed so much unnecessary, unmitigated suffering that they are forever changed, right? You're just compelled. I am completely driven. I can hardly think about anything else other than working on fixing this to make it better for the next kid that gets sick. And so it has changed everything. And then one of the early things that I did was to write an op-ed in December of 2017. You know, after every single mass gun violence incidents back then and still today, we always have the same conversations. Some people say, hey, we need sensible gun legislation. And of course, we really do. And other people will come out and say, hey, no, it's just people with mental illnesses. Right? And it doesn't go anywhere. And then NAMI, whom I love, I'm on the board member of NAMI Iowa. I love NAMI. But they come out with a statement that says, hey, people with mental illnesses are not more violent than anybody else. And there you are, stuck in this quagmire. Nothing's ever getting solved, right? And so I wrote an op-ed to unpack that really unfortunate conflation of issues and to address it more honestly, because here's the truth. People with treated mental illnesses, they are not more violent than anybody else. They just aren't. People with untreated mental illnesses, though, sometimes are. And in our country, we have somewhere between 4.2 and 5.1 million people with untreated serious mental illnesses. So yeah, sometimes they do commit these acts. It's not the majority of them. But hey, if you want to help solve this portion of it, let's do some solutions. And I listed some solutions. And on the day that this was published, I learned how many people across the country read the Des Moines Register because my phone blew up. It was unreal. But the most important person who reached out was Betsy Johnson from the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to improving the care of people with serious mental illness. And she said, Leslie, would you like to help us improve Iowa's commitment law so you can start treating people who don't know they're sick? And I said, yes, we would love to do that. And so my husband and I met with Senator Joe Bolcom, who was the closest senator to us at the time, who served on the HR or HHS committee now. And he agreed, he wrote the bill, and despite him being in the minority party, there's a lesson for somebody who is brand new to this, right? We still managed to get it attached to a much bigger bill, moving with a lot of political momentum that year, the Complex Needs Bill, otherwise known as the Governor's Bill. And she signed that into law, probably without even knowing that our little law was attached to it. I don't care, we got it done. That's a win, that's right. So I'm going to switch gears and talk to you briefly about what created the mental health crisis. And this is a very abbreviated version. There's a lot more to it. But from a basic standpoint, what happened was back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we had way too many people being placed into very large psychiatric hospitals across the country, right? And at the same time, they were really underfunded, they were understaffed. It was way too easy to get placed there. A husband could be angry with his wife and get her admitted, even if she didn't have a psychiatric illness. So it was bad. So with really good intentions, John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963. Thorazine had come onto the market and they thought that that was going to be a cure for schizophrenia. Didn't turn out to be. And they really believed that if they brought people out of these huge centers closer to home into community mental health centers, they would be better off. However, he was killed within a month of signing that legislation. In fact, it's the last law that he signed. And so he was not there. We didn't have a champion to build out that community mental health system. A couple of years later, the Vietnam War had been going on. The budget was shrinking from a federal perspective. And again, a really well-intended bill was signed. LBJ signed the Medicaid Act of 1965, which overall is wonderful, right? Our social safety net. But within it, it included this uniquely discriminatory legal policy called the IMD exclusion. IMD stands for Institutes of Mental Diseases. And what it did is it prevented federal matching Medicaid dollars for any facility that happened to have more than 16 beds for somebody with a psychiatric illness, right? You think it's not a big deal, but even today, our new access centers that opened up, how many beds can they have? 16, right? They thought if we make these places smaller, we will avoid the atrocities. But what really happened? Well, back in 1955, we were at our all-time high of how many people could be there. It was like 558,000 people in these state psychiatric hospitals, way too many, right? But now, across the whole country, we only have 38,000 of these beds. And actually, this data is a couple years old. We've lost more because of COVID, right? We really need about 123,000 more of these beds across the country, per the American Psychiatric Association and the Treatment Advocacy Center. In Iowa, just so you know this, we are the worst of the worst of the worst. We are 51st in the country. We only have 64 adult beds and 28 staffed child beds, which is far too few, okay? At the same time, our homeless population is growing. It's about 555,000 now across the country, right? And within our prisons, we have about 380,000 people with serious mental illness. Now, please understand, these people are not endemically criminals. If you took away the mental illness, they would not have gotten there, right? So how do they get there? Well, maybe they're homeless and they slept in the wrong place and they get arrested for trespassing. Off to jail they go, right? Or they're homeless and untreated, the voices take over and they do commit a crime. Off to prison they go. But here's another really frequent pathway, and I know this because we're connected to so many families across the country. A family in the midst of a psychiatric crisis manages to get their loved one into the hospital, right? But before they're treated and stabilized, that loved one acts out and assaults a staff member, which is bad. Don't get me wrong, right? But what does the hospital do? Rather than instituting better safety measures and treating the person for that illness that brought them there, no, they pick up the phone and they call the police and have the person arrested for the sin of having an illness that they have not yet chosen to treat. That is the crime, in my opinion. And this graph does a really good job, and for those of you in the room, I'm so sorry. As we've emptied out our mental health hospitals, we have been filling our jails and prisons. And for too long, we have accepted this very false premise that everyone is better off in the community. And I'm here to tell you they aren't. We have about, oh, I went one too far, or I didn't go far enough. We have about 140,000 people who are homeless and untreated for serious mental illness, okay? We have about 392,000 in our jails and in our prison, 12,000 in county jails and about 380,000 in our prisons. And where else are they ending up every single day? They are ending up in our graveyards. People are dying. These people are not better off, and we have to stop accepting that false premise. And we propose that it's time to fix the pendulum swing. We don't think everybody needs to be at a state hospital, but we also know the reality is we are not able to take care of everybody in the community with what we have currently available in the community. And we think we have to find an appropriate balance. And the way that we try to educate people about this is that we think about recovery. You know, we think of the recovery model for each individual person. We want to try to provide all the supports we can to hope for a really wonderful full recovery. But when we think about these patients as a cohort of patients, just like for any other illness, what we know is some people are more mildly affected and some people are much more severely affected. And, you know, we can break it up into simple categories. About a third of them, they're doing great. They are working, they're taking their meds, they're tax-paying citizen, they are among us. I know university professors that have bipolar disorders and schizophrenia where nobody else would ever know that unless they chose to disclose it, right? Another third, they are actually doing fine in the community. They might be getting help from an assertive community treatment team that helps to get them their meds or take them to appointments. They might not be able to work full-time, but they're doing okay working part-time and being on some disability. They're doing fine. But another third, they really do need 24/7 staffing. They need what we call housing that heals, not the warehousing of the past. Nobody is advocating to go back to that awful stuff, right? But we know that they really do need places like group homes, residential care facilities, and yes, mental health facilities, where my son is. And for too long, we've been ignoring that that bottom third exists. And we have not ever seen any place in Iowa that looks as bad as this picture here on the left, and I apologize to those of you in the room that can't see it. Nor have we seen one that's as decently nice as this one on the right. And for that, I feel ashamed as a fellow taxpayer, right? We could have long-term care facilities that are nicer. And if I were to win the lottery, I would go and give it all to the state if they'd let me go up to Independence, where my son is now, on this big, beautiful, gorgeous campus that looks like a college campus that's mostly sitting there unused. And I would create a psychiatric assisted living complex. I'd have an acute care unit where people could come during their first psychosis and stay long enough to figure out their meds, and have a first episode psychosis program, state of the art. We don't have very many of those in Iowa, but we need more, right? We could have subacute care units, we could have independent living units and group homes, we could have a cafe and a bookstore where people could start to work again with support. These could be places that we would be proud to work at, proud to visit, proud to volunteer at, proud to be a patient at, right? And how do I know this is possible? We already have similar facilities for another cohort of patients whose brains aren't working right? We have these for our elderly who have Alzheimer's and dementia. We all get it, that it's not acceptable to let Granny be abandoned in the middle of winter, walking down the street barefoot in her nightie, because her brain isn't working right anymore, right? She's not choosing to do that. We have to get people to understand we should not be doing that to our adult children who also have a problem with their brain not working right, at least for a time. So I'm going to shift gears again and talk back about why did we improve Iowa's commitment law. There is an issue with people who have serious mental illness like schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and bipolar disorders. A lot of them won't stay in treatment. They are not treatment adherent. They stop taking their meds over and over again, right? And a lot of us think, oh, that's just denial. They're just choosing not to do that. It's not that. It is something called anosognosia, okay? And it is a condition that is part of the brain illness itself that causes changes in the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain. Just like somebody who has a stroke, sometimes their left side of their body is paralyzed. And I say this because I've treated a lot of stroke patients as a physical therapist. You can't tell that person that their left leg is paralyzed. They will literally stand up and fall down, stand up and fall down, stand up and fall down repeatedly. There is no talking that away, just so you know. This exists in a lot of people who have schizophrenia and bipolar. It is not denial. And I have a short video. I don't know if I'm going to be able to play it or not, but I'll try. Is this hooked up for audio maybe? Yep, okay. So we'll share the slides, hopefully, and you can get to that. It's a wonderful video that explains about this and also talks about treatment courts. So one of the things the judge makes the point of in the video is that these people did not choose to become mentally ill. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to lose my sanity. I want to lose my job. I want to lose my family, right? No one makes that choice. And so across the country, we have treatment courts called civil mental health courts who do assisted outpatient treatment programs where they have somebody who is civil court committed to be compliant with outpatient treatment. And they come in and visit with a judge on a once-a-week basis to talk about what's going well, what's not going well. And they have this motivational interviewing over the course of time that helps them to gradually see about the fact that when they stay in treatment, they are not ending up back in the hospital and they're not ending up back in jail repeatedly. And these programs have existed for over 20 years across the country. And one of them that we have research from in New York State called Kendra's Law, what they have found is that they have like a 77% reduction in hospitalization. And forgive me, I don't remember the numbers. 87% reduction in incarceration, 77% reduction of homelessness. These are much better outcomes than we're currently getting for this patient population here in Iowa. And the research that has me very excited has been conducted by Dr. Dan Garza, who runs the program in Queens County. He's an awesome soul. And what they have found is that if they can keep somebody in treatment for 12 to 18 months, about 90% of them make that key connection. On my meds, not going back in the hospital. And it's much easier for them to gradually get the idea. And that tracks, because if we think back into like the 1970s when somebody could be in the hospital the first time for a psychosis, where they could stay for 6 months to a year, year and a half till they figured out those meds, they did much better than what we're currently getting for outcomes with a 72-hour hold, for instance. So that's really exciting. And so for the past 5 years, since we improved the commitment law to allow for this to happen here in Iowa, we have been working on building up a stakeholder team to start the first program in the state. And I'm happy to tell you that we finally got funding from our MHDS region over in Eastern Iowa to begin this first AOT program. And we are beginning the judicial referee interviews next week for the judge that will work with us. And we're going to be up and running in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And what those of you, well, thank you. It has taken a long time, but those of you that can see the slide, you'll notice that I have the police, I have the county attorney's office, we have the hospitals, the VA hospital, the impact team, which is the assertive community treatment team, we have Abbey Community Health, we have the substance use disorder treatment providers, we have all the key folks on board, which is really, it's taken years to get that to happen, but we're excited. So that's going to be started. And some of you might be wondering, why is she insisting on starting a civil mental health court versus a criminal one? Well, it comes down to the fact that we want to get to these people earlier. We want to get and help their brains become less sick before they get so sick that they intersect with the criminal justice system in the first place. Okay? And I wanted to share with you, if you are interested in knowing what to do to help support legislation that's helpful for improving the mental health care system, I have the link on here for getting onto the NAMI Iowa legislative newsletters. They send them out once a week during session. They're much like Connie's. Connie's are much more extensive, but these are focused very much on the bills that we're supporting and those that we're opposing. If any of you are interested enough to know, I tend to go ahead and weigh in on more bills than what NAMI Iowa does, because again, I don't have to worry about keeping anybody happy. So, you know, I tend to kind of go a little further. But that's a good way to know about most of it. The other thing that really helps, you all don't have to have all the answers about what we specifically need. But even if you just tell your legislators that improving the mental health care system is a priority, that is helpful. It lends us credibility in their minds. It helps to add, because as you know, for everything we try to work for and against, the more voices, the better. And I would encourage you to email them, always send an individual email. Group emails are not read by them. And include your federal legislators, because we are working at community level, state level, and federal level, because some of these policies that we have to change are federal. So please include that messaging with your federal legislators as well. And then another thing to do is to always support your local NAMI affiliates or NAMI Iowa. Literally, we are doing classes for people that live with mental illnesses, classes for families, we have support groups. They do so much more, and we do all of that work for free. And as you know, it's not really free to us. It costs a lot of money. So that's another way that can be helpful. I always like to take the opportunity to talk about suicide prevention, because over the past 16 years that our son has been sick, he has been suicidal many, many times. Would you like to know how many doctors or therapists or nurses or anybody ever talked to us about this? None. How many asked us if we had a gun in our home? One. I mention this because the number one way that we actually prevent suicides is removal of means. If there is a gun in the home, it's very important to get it locked up and get it removed from that person being able to get to it, right? Because if somebody uses a gun to attempt a suicide, it is lethal 90% of the time. Other types of suicide attempts are not lethal at that extent. It's somewhere between 4 to 11%. So really, we need to be educating people that removal of means is really helpful. In our house, we didn't happen to have a gun. We don't hunt, right? But what we did lock up were things from scissors to knives to all of our utensils to plastic bags when the voices were telling our son to suffocate himself. And nobody told us to do that. We had to figure that out via common sense. That's a shame. It should have been different than that for us. So I'm determined to help educate as many people as possible, because it can be different for other people. There was a study done a few years ago that showed that if somebody didn't show up for an appointment with a doc, with a therapist, whatever, and that office reached out to the person, email, text, phone call, snail mail, in some way, even if the person didn't end up going back, that act alone of somebody reaching out and saying, hey, you didn't make it in, we're concerned, would you like to get rescheduled? That act alone reduced suicides. It's impressive, right? So to me, translating that for lay people, what does that mean? Reach out. If somebody that you know doesn't show up, call them, text them, knock on their door, check in on them. It makes a difference if somebody knows that somebody noticed that they weren't there. Human connection and inclusion, that's suicide prevention. And of course, on a professional level, we want to help somebody develop a safety plan. You know, there's 988 to call now where you can get in direct contact with a mental health professional, somebody that's been trained to do this. There's mobile crisis. You can take them to the ED. I'd recommend getting to one of those other services first, because an ED is going to be a slower process for most people to actually talk to a mental health professional. And it's not necessarily the most therapeutic setting. Crisis centers are much better as well. Those have been really helpful. So I just always like to share that education. Now, ripples of hope come from this quote, and to those of you in the room, you aren't going to be able to read it, so I'll try to read it if I can get through it without crying. It's Robert Kennedy back in 1966, and he says, it is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring those ripples to build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. I apologize, I don't know what there is about that quote that always breaks me up, but it does. So what he was talking about, the social injustice at that time, was the practice of apartheid in South Africa, right? Thankfully, a couple decades after that, that practice was stopped. I think what's happening to people with serious mental illness in our state and in our country is a social injustice. It is a massive humanitarian crisis that too few people know about and even fewer people care about. And I'm hoping you'll join us in helping to change that. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and open it up to questions. Yes.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Just a moment. It is our practice to ask questions. If you're online, you can write your question in the chat. And for those in the room, I'll bring the microphone around to you so everybody can hear, including those who are online. Before we do that, there evidently is a car in the underground parking area. And all she gave me was license plate number, and I told her I don't know my license plate number, but anyway, JGJ234. And it is parked incorrectly, not in a parking place. So if you know that, she thought it was you. So I don't know what you want to do with that. So.
You mentioned that the commitment law had changed about 5 years ago. In what way did it change?
Yeah, thank you. So before, we could only have a civil commitment for outpatient treatment if somebody was currently a danger to themselves or others. And that made no sense, right? Because if somebody was currently a danger to themselves or others, they really needed to be an inpatient. And so there weren't many doctors and judges willing to write that order. So we changed it so that we could have somebody have an outpatient commitment to treatment if they had a history of repeated hospitalizations or incarcerations or arrests due to noncompliance with treatment. And that's what allows us to begin this outpatient treatment that's court ordered. Thanks for the question.
I have a question from online. How is untreated mental illness counted, and who is in this count or category?
Yeah, how is it counted? Well, I can tell you the prevalence. So about 1% of the population, 1 to 1.5% of the population has schizophrenia. And I think it's somewhere between 3 to 4% of the population that has serious mental illness. And we know that it's about 11 to 12 million people in the country that have that. But again, 4.5 to 5.1 million of those people, so almost half, are untreated for those serious mental illnesses. So, yes.
More a comment than anything else. I was the director of the Legal Aid Society for 35 years. And during the late 60s and 70s, when we first got started, we regularly filed habeas corpus actions to get people out. And I was involved in writing the civil commitment laws that were changed in the 1970s. As a matter of fact, I was the first witness called. Our problem then was the institutionally, everybody going into an institution, and that nobody did anything about it. So one of the things that we wrote into the law, which the American bar picked up on, was very innovative, was to require an advocate for the person once they got committed. Unfortunately, my experience is, the other thing is that we required in the civil commitment process immediate court intervention. It used to be a person would be taken out of their home, put in broadlines for 3 months or 3 weeks, and then eventually they would get a hearing. And by that time, anything else could happen to them. And yes, husbands and wives were filing regularly. And in one case we had is that both the husband and wife ended up in broadlines because they both had filed against themselves. But the thing, what's happened now is we have a judge that's set aside to hear civil commitment. We have a lawyer that to be one of the advocates, and then another person appointed out of the public defender's office. In my personal experience is they just simply become callous, and they use excuses to not follow through on the law, release people, and so on. The other sad part about it is that also in my work, I then eventually became, when I retired, became the clinic professor at Drake with elder law. And what we've, in that process, back and forth in that process, we found many occasions when you tried to use guardianship as a way for parents, first off, for somebody to be able to find out what's going on, what their child is, what medications they're having, what the treatment plan, all that. Guardianship would provide that, but it doesn't provide the control. And time after time, the only control that a parent could find is using the criminal justice system. Again, we do not have at all in this community the physical resources to put somebody in a care center, lock the door, and make sure they stay. Because if there's a center that deals with mental health, if the person runs, they're out of there. And you just simply, constantly, there's no ongoing plan. You've hit the issues. The issues are very, very difficult to deal with. There's a study done, I'm sorry to dominate this, but there's a study that was done that if you liberalize civil commitment, making it more difficult to commit people, we increase the criminal justice thing, which is exactly what happens. And if you do it the other way, then it goes back and forth. But yes, we have more people incarcerated for mental health than anything else.
Yeah, that's very true. And it is a fine line, right? We don't want to overstep that responsibility, and we don't want to overcommit people. That's not at all what we're talking about. But currently, as you know, we have people that literally die on our streets because somebody doesn't want to impinge upon their civil rights to refuse treatment. The problem is that person isn't refusing treatment with full capacity in their brain to understand that they're sick in the first place. And so we have to find the way to respect their human rights for sanity and dignity and life, and prioritize that over their misunderstood inability to volunteer for treatment, if that makes any sense to you. Yes, ma'am.
How is our health insurance and prescription insurance dealing with all this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the solutions that I've been working on trying to advocate for, and this is going to be a hard push, but we really need to change it so that the treating providers determine length of stay and medical necessity for length of stay in the hospital and at other levels of care as well. It should not be an insurance company making that determination with no skin in the game. Well, thank you for clapping for that. And that sounds very reasonable to you and I. That's a really hard push, I will tell you. But that is something that I really strongly believe is needed. In New York City, a friend of mine from the Treatment Advocacy Center is now the mental health policy advisor for Mayor Adams. And what they are doing is they are funding so that some of their hospitals can do a 90-day stay for people that they're bringing in who are homeless and untreated, and getting them treatment instead of leaving them abandoned on the streets. And that's a really nice step forward. That might be the way that we have to creatively figure out a way to fund extended treatment.
What a great presentation. Iowa has, at least a few years back, it seems to me that we've had one of the worst ratios in the nation of psychiatrists per person. And a number of the psychiatrists were leaving the public sector to work for Department of Corrections because of better pay, better hours, better working conditions there. So what are we doing here in Iowa to attract more psychiatrists? Because beds are important, but psychiatrists are too.
You're absolutely right. Workforce is a big piece of it. So 2 summers ago, Kelly Garcia invited me to give a talk during the legislative visit at the Mental Health Institute in Independence. And among the solutions were adding more psychiatric residencies, specifically at those mental health institutes, and sadly at the IMCC, the Iowa Iowa Medical Classification Center over in Coralville near me, where people with mental illnesses go for the prison system. And so we have a bill that is moving again this year that is to add 9 residencies and 2 fellows at those state facilities. So we're working on trying to get more buildup. We're also trying to promote that they might think about doing the same thing for PAs and psychiatric nurse practitioners, right? Because building up more than just psychiatrists would also help. And if you were to ask Representative Ann Meyer, she would tell you that that's why she also did the tort reform bill. I know that's controversial, but I'm just going to tell you that there are people with good intentions trying to work on multiple different ways to improve that staffing. Yeah.
Hey, first of all, I just want to thank you so much for this. This is so important. I sort of know the answer to this a bit because my husband is in the mental health profession, but I wanted you to speak more broadly to this for everyone. As a member, I'm a gay man, and can you talk a little bit about how mental health impacts the LGBTQ plus community? Is there a disparate impact on that community in particular? Do you feel that there would be a way to handle treatment for like mental illness in the LGBTQ community differently, or how that should be approached?
That's a really good question. So this has been, a tough year for this community, as all of you know, because of Connie's wonderful advocacy on their behalf, as well as Keenan's. So a couple of different points. Some of the legislators have said awful things, such as being LGBTQ is a mental illness. I want to make it clear that that's not true. That is not the case, right? And all of you in this room and online know that. However, some of the discriminatory policies that they're working on passing and other cultural things are making it very difficult for people who live as LGBTQ plus. And they are at much higher risk for depression and anxiety and suicide. And so, I am very concerned that we are going to see a massive increase. And in fact, in talking with mental health professionals at our NAMI Day on the Hill a week ago or so ago, they're already seeing it. I mean, just having those bills written has adversely affected people. It's a real concern. Do I think they need any different treatment? I'm not a mental health professional, so I don't think I can speak to that. I think every person deserves compassionate, thorough mental health care. So that would be my statement on that.
Other questions? All right, well, help me to thank Leslie Carpenter so much for not only for being here today, but also for your advocacy and expertise. Was I right that she is amazing?
Thank you.
Not often right, but I am about that. So thank you so much for all the time you spend at the State House and for being with us today. And again, my apologies to those in the room for our technical issues. I think the people online got to see the slides, so good for you. That's awesome. And the people in the room got snickerdoodles, so it's, you know, like, right? And Leslie brought those, obviously, so thank you for doing that as well. Next month in April, we're not sure. We will not be here. That we do know because it's the massive garage sale for Plymouth, and so this room will be filled with stuff. So you can come and you can shop or whatever, but we won't be here, and so we're working on details for that. So look for that in our Mosaic newsletter that comes out on Tuesday, and hopefully we'll have all the details figured out at that point. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you again, Leslie, for being here and sharing all of your information and wisdom, and have a great weekend. Thank you.